Cortes and Montezuma. When the Spanish came to Central America, they discovered that the Aztecs were already ruling an empire there. Before the Spanish conquistadores could settle down, they would have to conquer the Aztecs, and the Aztecs were skillful, fierce warriors. But when the Spanish first arrived, the Aztecs didn't realize they were being invaded. They thought they were being visited by the gods. The story starts when a Spanish adventurer named Hernan Cortes came to the West Indies. Those are the islands east of Central America, remember? He had hoped to find his fortune in the Spanish colonies there, but he was disappointed. There wasn't very much money in the West Indies. But Cortes heard rumors that over on the mainland of Central America, a fantastically wealthy king ruled over a city with streets made of gold and walls made of jewels. So Cortes collected a band of soldiers to go with him, loaded Spanish war horses onto a ship, and sailed to the coast of Central America. When his ship anchored, the tribes who lived near the water came out to see who these new visitors were. But when Cortes and his men unloaded their horses from their ships and rowed them ashore, the Indians scattered in terror. They had never seen horses before. They thought each horse and rider was a huge monster with 6 feet, 2 arms, and 2 heads. These Indians spread the word all through the mainland. Monsters are coming. Perhaps they're the gods. And Cortes and his men plunged into the Central American jungles, searching for the city of gold. They came closer and closer to the edge of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs who lived on the border of the empire weren't entirely sure who these visitors were. So they came out with gifts for Cortes and his men. Wheels of gold as high as a man's waist, golden shields, and buckets full of gold dust. When Cortes saw these gifts, he was more convinced than ever that great treasure was just beyond his reach. He ordered his men, "Keep on! The city of gold is still ahead of us." Meanwhile, the Aztecs who brought the gifts sent messages back to their capital city, Tenochtitlan. The visitors are approaching, they warned, and they described Cortes, his men, and their armor. The king of the Aztecs, Montezuma, listened to these descriptions carefully. He wondered, could this be the god Quetzalcoatl on his way back to Tenochtitlan? Ancient Aztec prophecies said that the god Quetzalcoatl would return 500 years after leaving his people. And according to the Aztec calendar, the 500 years was almost up. Also, the description of Cortes sounded like the carved pictures of Quetzalcoatl on the temple walls. By chance, the helmet Cortes wore was shaped like Quetzalcoatl's hat. When Montezuma dreamed one night that Quetzalcoatl was approaching to claim his throne, his mind was made up. The god was on his way. So when Cortes and his men arrived, Montezuma threw open the city gates and welcomed him in. Cortes didn't see streets of gold and jeweled walls, but there was plenty of gold in Tenochtitlan. For 8 months, Cortes and his men lolled about in the city, enjoying the luxury and stashing away gold jewelry and treasure for themselves. But Cortes's men began to get bored. They started quarreling with the Aztec priests. A fight broke out and several Aztecs were killed. When Montezuma and his men saw the bodies of their friends, they shouted, "Quetzalcoatl would never behave in this way." They armed themselves and began to battle with the intruders. After the fighting raged up and down the city streets, in and out of the palace, Montezuma was killed. Cortes and his men were driven back into Montezuma's royal palace. They locked themselves in, but now they were surrounded by fierce Aztec warriors waiting for them to emerge. What would the Spanish do now? They waited and waited. They waited for days inside the palace. Late one night, one of the lookouts hissed, The square around the palace is empty. Cortes peered out. Sure enough, the streets were still. The city seemed to be deserted. Perhaps another war had drawn the Aztec warriors away. Cortes and his men stuffed their pockets with all the gold they could carry and tiptoed out of the palace. Around them, the city lay quiet beneath a bright moon. They hurried along the stone-paved streets towards the nearest gate. The gate was open, but the timbers that would fill the moat was missing. Water stretched between their feet and the beginning of the raised road that led to the lakeshore. "Quick!" Cortes hissed. "Find wood, anywhere you can. Let's build a bridge." Their hands shaking with haste, the men ripped wood from nearby buildings and built a makeshift bridge. They lowered it over the gap and began to file across. Suddenly they heard a whoop. The water around them was filled with canoes, and each canoe had an armed Aztec warrior in it. They had walked into the Aztec trap. The Spaniards tried to fight back, but they were so weighted down with gold that the ones who fell into the water of Lake Texcoco drowned. Only Cortes and a few of his best soldiers escaped. They limped back to the ocean under cover of dark and pushed their ships back out in the water. Cortes had to return to the West Indies beaten. But he wasn't finished yet. He collected new men, new horses, and carpenters. With this fresh force, he sailed back over the shore of the mainland and marched back towards Tenochtitlan. On his way, he convinced other tribes to join him in his war against the Aztecs. Many of the villages who lived near Aztec land had been raided by Aztec warriors who kidnapped their young men and women and took them back to Tenochtitlan for human sacrifices. They were very willing to help Cortes fight against the city. When Cortes arrived at Lake Texcoco, he had his carpenters build 12 small warships right there on the shore of the lake. He loaded these ships with soldiers and launched them into the water. The Aztec canoes poured out into the lake to meet him. The siege of Tenochtitlan had begun. The battle went on for 3 months. But Cortes had collected almost 100,000 Spanish soldiers and Indian allies. He cut off all access to the shore so that the city began to run out of food and water. At last, the city of Tenochtitlan was forced to surrender. In the year 1519, Cortes marched into the city and took over. Now, he was the governor of the new Spanish colony in Central America.